They broke down the door at 3 a.m. over a backyard shed they claimed was built a foot too close to the fence. Leading them was a former cop, fired for excessive force, who had turned a quiet HOA into his own private power trip. But what he didn't count on was a war veteran behind that wall, and a grandson who refused to stay silent. This isn't just a story about rules gone too far. It's about the moment justice hit back and how one shot through drywall changed everything. Alderwood Lane was the kind of street that made you forget the world could ever be loud, a place where porch lights clicked off by 9 p.m., and the most exciting thing on a Saturday was the sound of sprinklers turning on. By 3 a.m., even the wind seemed careful not to disturb the silence. Inside a single-story home at the corner of the block, Kyle Pearson lay sprawled on the living room couch, snoring lightly, the soft blue glow of a paused video game still flickering on the screen in front of him. His gaming headset had slipped sideways around his neck. A half-empty bottle of root beer rested on the coffee table, untouched for hours. Then everything changed in one deafening instant. A thunderous crash tore through the silence. Wood splintered, metal screeched, and the front door of the house gave way like it had been hit by a battering ram. The sound wasn't gradual or confused. It was clean, practiced, and loud enough to wake the whole street. Kyle bolted upright, lungs frozen mid-breath. His heart slammed against his ribs as if trying to warn him before his brain could catch up. Before he could fully register what was happening, 4 men rushed into the house, voices overlapping in aggressive commands. HOA, security, back up, hands where we can see them. Kyle blinked, stunned. His ears rang. The figures moved fast, wearing black tactical vests with white block letters that read, security. It looked official at first glance, but nothing about it felt right. No badges, no lights outside, no sirens, just 4 unfamiliar men in his living room, scanning the space like they'd rehearsed this. He looked down. He was wearing gym shorts and socks. He hadn't even made it to bed that night. The door, the actual solid front door, was lying flat on the floor behind them, half cracked. Cold air rushed into the house. One of the men stepped on Kyle's headset, snapping it with a crunch. Kyle tried to speak but couldn't. His voice was buried under shock. And 20 feet away, down the hall, in the master bedroom with the door closed, his grandfather had just woken up too. Walter Pearson was 78, a Vietnam veteran. Years ago, a roadside blast took most of his hearing and left him with scars that didn't show up on skin. At night, he still slept light, as if somewhere deep inside, he never stopped being on patrol. The moment that crash hit, Walter's eyes snapped open. He heard the low tremble of voices. Nothing. But not what they said. Just the tone, the force, the unmistakable sign of a home being breached. He sat up in bed, heartbeat rising. To Walter, this wasn't a break-in. This was war. In one smooth motion, he opened the nightstand drawer. His hand found the grip of his old revolver. The one he kept nearby, always locked and clean. He aimed toward the sound and pulled the trigger. A single round ripped through the bedroom wall, cutting through drywall and silence alike. The shot punched through the wall with a hollow crack, kicking up a cloud of chalky dust and bits of shredded insulation. It missed one of the intruders by mere inches, close enough to sting his ear with hot air and fill his eyes with plaster flakes. The hallway exploded into confusion. "He's armed! Down, down, move back!" Their voices overlapped, high-pitched and frantic, all pretense of authority gone. One man dove behind the entryway table, knocking over a framed photo. Another backed into a coat rack and nearly fell over. The third man, tall, maybe mid-40s, bald, froze in place, his hands trembling. "I've been shot," he yelled, clutching his shoulder. But there was no blood, no wound, just panic. The other 2 reached for their belts, pulling out stun devices. Standard civilian tasers, but in the low hallway light, they looked a lot more intimidating than they were. They edged toward Walter's room, like they were preparing for a confrontation they hadn't trained for. That's when Kyle stepped between them, his arms wide, voice cracking from panic and adrenaline. "Stop! He's a veteran! He doesn't know what's going on! Just back off!" For a few seconds, everything stopped. No one moved. The dust hung in the hallway air like smoke. The only sound was the soft creak of a floorboard behind Kyle. Walter shifting position on the other side of the wall. And in that frozen moment, Kyle saw them for what they really were. These weren't officers. They weren't part of any emergency response team. They were regular men, neighbors mostly, dressed in tactical-looking gear they'd either bought online or had custom printed. Their black vests bore the bold white letters, HOA Security. But that meant nothing in the eyes of the law. These weren't trained professionals. They were members of the new HOA Enforcement Committee, a group that had popped up barely 6 months ago after the previous HOA board resigned over a budget scandal. Their leader, Gerald Knox, had promised a safer, more structured neighborhood that included stricter enforcement of rules, zero tolerance for non-compliance, and, apparently, early morning home raids. And their target that night? A backyard shed, 8 by 10 feet, painted gray, built by Kyle and Walter together 3 months prior to store old tools and gardening gear. The issue? It stood 15 inches too close to the property line. According to the HOA's revised regulations, 15 inches. That's what triggered the door getting kicked in. That's what nearly caused a man to be hurt. That's what sent a war veteran into survival mode. Kyle felt something cold settle in his chest, a realization. This wasn't about a shed. This was about power. And for the first time since the chaos began, he felt angry. The dust had barely settled when Kyle finally found his voice. He stood face to face with the man who led the raid. Tall, broad-shouldered, slightly winded, his tactical vest sitting too snug around his chest. A clipboard dangled from one hand, as if paperwork could justify the destruction they just caused. His name was Gerald Knox, president of the HOA board. Kyle recognized him. He'd seen him at community barbecues, giving long-winded speeches about lawn height regulations and mailbox design. He always talked about protecting the neighborhood standard. But this wasn't standard. This was insane. Gerald adjusted his vest and pointed stiffly toward the backyard, past the living room window where a sliver of the shed was visible. Structure violates boundary code 11.6b, he said flatly. Sits outside the permitted limit by approximately 15 inches. Kyle blinked, struggling to comprehend. 15 inches? He repeated. Yes, Gerald confirmed. You were notified by mail in January. Kyle remembered the letter. It had been generic, just a reminder to review outdoor structures for compliance. No deadline, no warning, no mention that, if ignored, it might result in a group of uninvited men tearing down the door in the middle of the night. No follow-up notice? Kyle asked, voice rising. Gerald shrugged. Non-compliance triggers enforcement. Kyle glanced around the room. The broken door, the hole in the wall, his grandfather's bedroom just a few feet away. Walter hadn't come out since the shot, probably sitting on the edge of his bed, still unsure whether he was back in Arizona or reliving something far worse. You mean to tell me, Kyle said slowly, that you brought 4 people into my house at 3 a.m. because of a shed that's a foot and change over some imaginary line? Gerald didn't even flinch. It's not imaginary. It's in the bylaws. Kyle took a step closer, fury threatening to spill out. You nearly got someone hurt. My grandfather could have had a panic attack, or worse. One of your guys thought he'd been hit. You could have gotten yourself seriously injured. Gerald met his eyes, calm as ever. The HOA board approved the action. Our rules are clear. Kyle stared at him in disbelief. Not an ounce of apology. Not even a pause. Just protocol. Just paper. For Gerald, this wasn't a disaster. It was procedure. A checkbox. An act of community protection done by the book, even if the book didn't make sense anymore. The others, the so-called security team, had started to pull back. Their energy was gone. One was sitting on the curb, silent. Another paced in the grass, avoiding eye contact. But Gerald stood firm. In his eyes, he hadn't done anything wrong. And that realization hit Kyle harder than the door ever could. This wasn't just about the shed, or the fence line, or even the rules themselves. This was about control, and what people were willing to sacrifice to keep it. It was nearly 3:50 a.m. when the calm was broken for the second time that night, this time by the soft wash of red and blue lights across the front yard. There were no loud sirens, just the low crunch of tires on gravel as 2 marked patrol cars, rolled up to the curb in front of Kyle's house. It was a quiet arrival, purposeful, professional, the kind that comes when the danger might already be over, but something serious has clearly happened. Kyle stood at the edge of the driveway, still barefoot, his phone tight in his hand. His heart hadn't slowed since the shot. The adrenaline had shifted, from fear to anger, and now to something closer to stunned exhaustion. A tall, broad-shouldered officer stepped out of the first cruiser, Sergeant Dennison, as his badge later read. Mid-40s, sharp features, short sleeves despite the chill, and a calmness in his stride that didn't ask for authority. It carried it. His eyes scanned everything in seconds. The door, completely off its hinges. The hallway beyond, covered in debris and insulation dust. Four grown men in black vests now trying their best to blend into the background. Kyle, pale, standing in the cold with a quiet kind of fire in his eyes. Dennison approached. Kyle didn't wait. "I have footage from the Ring camera." He handed over the phone, already queued up to the clip. Dennison held it steady, watched silently. The video spoke for itself. In 35 seconds, it captured the full weight of what had happened. The front porch, moments before impact. The sudden violent break-in. Voices yelling, "HOA, security." But no legal badge, no formal ID. No police in sight, no warrant read. Four men flooding into a private home without permission. And the echo of a single gunshot a few seconds later. Dennison finished the video, paused, then looked at Kyle. His voice was low and even. "Did they have a warrant?" Kyle shook his head once. "No, nothing. Just showed up and kicked the door in." "Did anyone in the home invite them inside?" "Absolutely not," Kyle said firmly. "They didn't knock. They didn't identify themselves to us directly. They didn't even try to talk. They just came in like it was theirs." Dennison nodded slowly. He wasn't shocked, not quite, but his jaw tensed. He stepped past Kyle into the doorway. The scene spoke for itself. Furniture knocked aside. Splinters from the door scattered like shrapnel. Footprints through the insulation dust. And in the back corner of the living room, lit only by the hallway light, sat Walter Pearson. He was wrapped in a beige army-issued blanket, motionless in a recliner near the hallway. The revolver was no longer in his hand. Kyle had gently taken it and laid it on the kitchen counter, safety on, barrel pointed away. Walter's eyes were open, but distant, focused somewhere else. Dennison didn't approach. He just looked at him with quiet understanding. Then he turned back to Kyle. "That shed out back," he asked. "That what this is about?" Kyle nodded. "They say it's over the line, 15 inches. Dennison's brow furrowed. He looked again at the house, at Walter, at the broken threshold. "Then they committed unlawful entry," he said simply. His voice didn't rise. He didn't dramatize it. He just said the words plainly, like reading a fact aloud from a page. Then he added, nodding toward Walter, "And your grandfather was well within his right to defend his home, given his condition, even more so." The moment felt unreal, like something had finally clicked back into place. For the first time that night, Kyle felt the weight shift, the fear and confusion, the chaos of four strangers barging into their home, the sound of the gunshot. It all had context now. It wasn't madness. It wasn't overreaction. It was defense. And it was justified. Behind them, the so-called HOA security looked smaller now, their vests suddenly awkward, their presence unjustified. One of them had taken off his gear and set it on the porch rail. Another was on his phone, pacing quietly, face pale. But it was Gerald Knox, the self-appointed enforcer, who stood apart, arms crossed, clipboard still tucked under one elbow. He stared into the darkness, silent. The man who had brought order crashing into chaos. And now, for the first time, it seemed he understood. This wasn't his jurisdiction anymore. It belonged to the law. The hallway was quiet again. No shouting, no commands. Just the low hum of the cruiser engines outside and the soft, almost sacred silence that fills a room after everything chaotic has already happened. Walter Pearson hadn't said a word since the shot. He sat in his chair near the living room wall, wrapped in an old beige army blanket that looked like it had been with him longer than most people he knew. His hands were still, his breathing slow, but there was something in his expression, a stillness that wasn't peace. It was focus, a kind that doesn't come from calm, but from habit, from memory. One of the younger officers, Officer Marquez, approached carefully, not like someone questioning a suspect, but like someone speaking to a man who just returned from a place no one else in the room had ever seen. He crouched down slightly, spoke with respect in his voice. "Sir, did you mean to fire?" Walter didn't respond right away. He looked ahead, past the officer, past the door frame, into something much farther than the street outside. Then, quietly, without looking up, he said, "I thought the war was back." The officer straightened slightly, taken aback not by fear, but by the weight behind the words. Walter turned his head slowly toward him, his eyes sharp but distant. "Last time someone kicked down my door, it wasn't in Arizona." The room stilled. Kyle, who had been standing nearby, stepped forward. He didn't speak, just placed a hand gently on his grandfather's shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it grounded everything. Walter leaned back into the chair, the blanket rustling softly. He let out a slow breath, then added under his breath, not loud, not threatening, just matter of fact, "Next time, I won't miss." No one spoke, not the officers, not Kyle, not even Gerald Knox, who stood frozen near the window, suddenly realizing the world he'd tried to control had lines he should never have crossed. Walter wasn't unstable, he wasn't dangerous. He was a soldier who never got to stop being one. And for the first time that night, everyone in the room understood why that single gunshot had been fired. It wasn't revenge, it wasn't anger, it was instinct. The same instinct that had once kept him alive, only now it had been triggered in his own home, in a neighborhood that was supposed to be peaceful. And that truth sat heavier than anything else. In the quiet days that followed, after the dust had literally settled and the news van stopped circling the neighborhood, Kyle began to dig. He wanted answers, not just about the shed or the bylaws, but about the man who had walked into his home like he owned it. Gerald Knox. To the untrained eye, Gerald had always looked the part. Clean-shaven, polished boots, a certain stiffness in his posture, like someone who once wore a uniform and never fully let it go. He spoke in clipped sentences, nodded without smiling, repeated phrases like regulation and compliance, as if they were holy words. But beneath the surface, a different picture was starting to take shape. It turned out Gerald had once been a police officer nearly a decade ago, but his career had ended abruptly in 2014. The official reason, excessive use of force during a civilian detainment. The Internal Affairs report, which Kyle found referenced in a forum post, called it a pattern of escalating behavior inconsistent with department standards. In short, he didn't de-escalate, he dominated. After his dismissal, Gerald didn't disappear, he just shifted lanes, bounced between private security contracts, loss prevention teams, campus patrol gigs, never lasting long in one place, but always finding another badge to wear, until 2 years ago when he moved into Alderwood Lane. No one thought much of it. He was polite, clean-cut, offered to volunteer for the HOA board. At first, he helped with small things, repainting signs, organizing files, answering emails. But then the tone started to change. He proposed new subcommittees, suggested policy tightening, started pushing for amendments to the HOA charter, small adjustments buried in pages of dense language that shifted power in quiet ways. Over time, the other board members either stepped down or were quietly replaced by names few people recognized. And by the time anyone really noticed, Gerald wasn't just on the HOA board, he was the board. He created the so-called Neighborhood Compliance Unit, a fancy title for a group of 4 residents, hand-picked by him. They weren't licensed, they weren't trained, but they were loyal, and they were outfitted. Kyle found online receipts forwarded by a neighbor, bulk orders from secondhand equipment sites, old tactical vests, flashlights, utility belts, all shipped to Gerald's address. One purchase stood out, a bundle of military surplus vests, customized with a vinyl heat press. White block letters, security. From the outside, it looked official, authoritative, dangerously convincing. Gerald had turned a suburban HOA into his own personal structure of control, a miniature chain of command. No oversight, no accountability, just paperwork, uniforms, and the illusion of authority. For him, it wasn't about keeping the neighborhood safe. It was about being in charge. In any other setting, maybe it would have stayed harmless. Rules about mailbox color, lawn length, paint tones. But the night he kicked in that door, the game ended. A single bullet tore through the drywall, and with it, the fantasy. Kyle hadn't planned to start a movement. He posted the ring footage online mostly out of frustration, a way to show what really happened. The video was under a minute, shaky but clear. The door crashing in, the shouting, the confusion, and the single shot through the wall. By sunrise, it had gone viral. Thousands of comments poured in overnight. This is why HOAs have gone too far. That grandfather's a national treasure. They walked into the wrong house. This man deserves a medal, not a hearing. Memes followed. Someone photoshopped Walter onto a movie poster with the words, "Backyard rules. HOA never stood a chance." Another clip replayed the gunshot in slow motion with dramatic violin music. But beyond the internet noise, real things started happening. Local news ran the story, then regional. In less than 3 days, a temporary injunction froze the HOA's authority. Gerald Knox was suspended pending investigation, along with 2 others from his committee. The internet had done what paperwork couldn't, and fast. Walter, for his part, barely reacted. He didn't seek out the attention. He didn't even look up when people knocked on the door, but they came anyway. Strangers, neighbors, veterans, mothers, teenagers. Some brought letters, others just nodded and said, "Thank you." Walter would listen, pause, then say the same thing every time. "Should have aimed 2 inches left." He said it quietly, not as a threat, but as a reminder that sometimes respect is earned through silence and one very loud message. The neighborhood was quiet again. The front door had been replaced, the drywall repaired, and the Ring camera now backed up to 3 separate drives. On the surface, everything looked normal, but inside the house, things had shifted. This wasn't over, and Kyle knew it couldn't be. He and Walter filed a lawsuit. No press, no headlines, just a clean, direct claim. Unlawful entry, emotional distress, property damage. Aggravated endangerment of a senior. What had happened wasn't just a bad decision. It was a chain of events built on entitlement, poor judgment, and unchecked power, and someone had to put a legal boundary around that. Not for revenge, but for clarity. 1 week later, the offer came in. A settlement, $15,000. No public statement, no court record, just money in exchange for silence. The letter called it a reasonable resolution for all parties. Kyle called it something else, a shortcut out of accountability. He didn't even bring it up to Walter. He already knew what the answer would be. Their attorney, John Rivers, was measured and meticulous. He'd handled bigger cases, more expensive ones, but this one hit differently. Maybe because of the footage. Maybe because of the absurdity of the HOA's actions. Maybe because of Walter. After watching the video 3 times, John had said, "This isn't just a lawsuit. It's a message. You're doing the right thing." And Kyle wasn't interested in silence. He wasn't interested in revenge either. He was interested in making sure it never happened again. To anyone. So when the day came to give a statement under oath, Kyle kept it simple. He looked at the judge. No theatrics, no anger, just a clear voice and a straight back. They used fear to control a neighborhood. I want them to feel what fear really is. Not the kind that kicks in doors, the kind that comes when people realize they've gone too far and the world is watching. There was no applause, no camera flashes, just the quiet weight of a room understanding something important had just been said. He stepped down. The tape was entered into evidence. And for the first time since the night of the break-in, Kyle felt something solid beneath his feet. Not just justice on the way, but the beginning of balance being restored. By the time summer turned the lawns dry and the mailboxes hot to the touch, the verdict had been delivered, not just by the court, but by the community itself. The HOA was dissolved. A court order officially stripped the organization of its authority after a formal review of its actions, structure, and leadership. What had once been called a neighborhood improvement body was now legally recognized as a danger to its own residents. And Gerald Knox? He wasn't giving speeches anymore. He faced formal charges, impersonating an officer, reckless endangerment, and violating private property statutes. His vest, his clipboard, his title, none of it held up when placed under the weight of real law. In the end, all the power he thought he had turned out to be just letters on fabric. Back on Alderwood Lane, life slowly returned to normal, or at least something that resembled it. Kyle replaced the front door with a reinforced steel model, nothing flashy, just secure. One quiet message to the world that what happened once wouldn't happen again. Walter? He didn't ask for much, didn't want smart locks or motion detectors, just a simple metal sign screwed into the brick beside the new doorbell. It read, "This house is protected by the Constitution, not a committee." Neighbors chuckled. A few took photos. One family 2 streets over put up a version of their own. Some mornings, Kyle would catch his grandfather on the porch, sitting in that same worn recliner, an old cap on his head, a glass of iced tea resting quietly beside him. He never said much, never brought it up again unless someone asked. And if they did, a neighbor, a journalist, a passerby who recognized him from the video, Walter would just offer a slow smile and say with a shrug, "Finally, peace and quiet." But this time, he meant it. Not just as a phrase, but as something earned, not given by an HOA, not protected by bylaws, but built inch by inch through patience, strength, and the kind of silence that holds more weight than any shouted rule.